I'm Andrew Norton, I'm Director of IIED, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. It's great to have such a good turnout. Sort of picking over what happened at COP25 in Madrid. Obviously, in many ways it was disappointing, but maybe there were chinks of light as well. Some of you may have seen a blog on our site this morning by Sopo Barakat, which picked out some of the areas where there perhaps are things that we can build on for COP26. But obviously, at COP25, well, firstly, it had the dubious distinction of being the longest ever of the COPs, of the climate conferences, extending over 2 days, which meant that many delegates from the poorest countries were not able to stay because they weren't able to kind of review their travel arrangements. So there are issues there, but also many issues not finalising, not doing the work that was already passed over from COP24 on Article 6, the mechanism on carbon markets, but many other areas as well, notably the failure at this point of big emitters to bring major proposals for emissions reduction. We can hope that some of that will happen at COP26, but obviously the sort of geopolitics that were evident at COP25 with big G20 countries acting to kind of disrupt the process, whether Australia in the news for many reasons at the moment, Brazil, US obviously, and Saudi Arabia, and perhaps others not quite so overtly. So there is obviously a difficulty at that level and a challenge to the Paris process. But at the same time, COP26 has considerable advantages over COP25. COP25 was disrupted by the move from Chile to Madrid. The UK has a bit of a run at COP26, maybe not as long as France had at COP21, but some opportunity to gather momentum and make things happen at COP26 that were disappointing at COP25. But perhaps there were also chinks of light in what happened at COP25 on areas, surprisingly, like loss and damage and so on. So looking forward to having our great panel digging into that. I'll allow Richard to introduce the panel, but let me introduce Richard first. To have Richard Black with us, who's the Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, formerly BBC Environment Correspondent, and many other things as well. So Richard, many thanks.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Thanks very much for the invitation.
And actually, I have forgotten something, which is the announcements.
Yeah, sorry, thank you.
I always do that.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. We aren't expecting any fire alarms tests this morning, so if a fire alarm goes off, then that's our fire exit, and there's a number of IIED staff in here, so we'll just lead you out there, and we gather on Portpool Lane. It's quite busy in here. There are a couple of seats. If there's some people at the back who do want to sit down, there's 2 there, and then there's 2 here, so please feel free to take a seat if you'd like. There's an aisle here if you want to access them. And then in terms of the bathrooms, the ladies' loos are in between this floor and the ground floor, and then the men's loos are between the ground floor and the first floor. And that's it. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, yes, one more thing. It's being streamed on Facebook, this event as well, so afterwards there'll be a recording there if you need it. Thanks.
Yeah. Just to say, there are a few more seats down the front, so if anyone wants a seat who's there, do come and grab one. A couple over there as well. Thanks. So who here is a Madrid survivor? Who are there? Well, congratulations. Well, one of my takeaways from the COPs I've been is that you never know everything that's going on. They're just way too big, and there's far too much going on in the corridors that you never really get to see. So I'm really looking forward to our distillation of what happened there, largely from the perspective of the LDCs, and where this takes us, looking ahead to the Glasgow summit. So let me introduce our panellists without any further ado. Clare Shakya is Group Director of the Climate Change Group here at IIED. Nick Mabey is CEO of E3G, which, as many of you will know, is doing a lot of work with the UK government on diplomacy and indeed with other governments on diplomacy for COP26. Anna Schulz is Principal Researcher and Advisor to the LDC Group. And last but actually first is Gabriel Swaybe, who's a researcher in the Climate Change Group. So the way we're going to do this, Gabriel's going to first of all take us through COP25, look back at what some of the highlights and the lowlights that Andy alluded to. Anna's then going to look at sort of take a look at the UN process and in the context of what the LDCs need, and whether it's really fit for purpose at the moment, and if not, how it could be retooled. Nick's going to give some insights into the state of diplomacy now, with a particular focus on where the UK presidency is at. And Claire's going to round off with a look at some of the wider geopolitical challenges and some of the sort of really large-scale issues that we face in the year ahead. So, Gabby, over to you.
Great, thanks Richard, and thanks for having me. It's great to see so many people this morning. So I will speak a bit more towards what the least developed countries group experienced at COP25, their expectations going in, and if COP25 was able to deliver on those expectations. As Andy and Richard have mentioned, it was a trying COP for all involved, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable. Myself and my team, we support the LDC group in the negotiations. It's a negotiating bloc of 47 of the poorest countries in the world, representing 1 billion people across Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. These countries who contributed the least to climate change, have the least capacity to respond to climate change, yet suffer the most from its impacts. And this COP, they were going in with high expectations to really look for strong outcomes on a few big ticket items, those being loss and damage, Article 6 and mechanism for carbon markets, as well as overall ambition and signals that 2020 is going to see a change in the political will of countries in addressing climate change. On loss and damage, this year up for review was the international mechanism that is supposed to help countries address the losses and damages caused by climate change. Essentially, countries, LDCs and AOSIS and other vulnerables were looking for countries to show solidarity. They're owed financial support for a lot of the impacts that they're suffering from climate change that they aren't able to recover and recalibrate on their own. So the loss and damage review, the mechanism for reviewing that, the mechanism for addressing that was up for review this year. And then also for carbon markets, this was a leftover item from COP24. The markets mechanisms was a controversial one at the end of COP24, so they decided to pass it over to try and finalize the negotiations on that this year. Basically, countries agreed to disagree, yet again. It was very controversial, and in this case, it wasn't only the developed or rich countries that were holding things up, but the likes of Brazil and others, rogue nations from wider G20 context were those that were putting up a fight on that. And lastly, on ambition, essentially LDCs were looking for the COP and for the Chilean presidency to send a strong, clear signal that 2020 would be the year for increased ambition, and to show that in the decision text and to show that in how the outcomes of COP were presented at the end. So what happened? Well, groups of progressive countries, the LDCs, the small island developing states, AOSIS, the Latin American countries, ILAC, as well as the EU, were up against some of, as Andy said, these G20 countries that were had some disruptive intentions. So the US certainly, but Saudi Arabia, China, Brazil, and others. And it was, it's important to note here that it's not, this dynamic of developed versus developing wasn't really in existence this time around. It was across the board political entrenchment from countries that just were not giving that political movement and were very much sticking to their red lines. What else happened? Because of this lack of political investment in climate action that we're seeing in the world, it translated into, as I said, not much movement in countries moving through their red lines. And there were a few missteps along the way from, I'd have to say, the Chilean presidency and others. At one point late in the night in week 2, LDCs, AOSIS, and some other countries were excluded from certain negotiations. And this was definitely a field for a breach of trust, where they weren't being able to be totally inclusive throughout the process. And there were myriad of other things that happened throughout the 2 weeks. So then it begs the question, did COP25 deliver on what the LDCs wanted it to deliver? And yes and no, maybe leaning more towards the no side. On loss and damage, the review of the international mechanism, it did show that there is not enough financial support out there for countries that needed it. And in the text of the outcomes for that loss and damage review, it did speak to that. But then in so doing, it also risks the idea that finances and funding would then be carved out of what is already coming through climate finance for adaptation. And adaptation and loss and damage are very much separate entities and issues that need to be dealt with. And by not sort of explicitly making that true in the text, it risks that money that is needed for adaptation is then going to go to loss and damage, thus making not enough funding coming for either thematic area a real possibility. Also on the governance of the international mechanism, very technical, but essentially it was a negotiating tactic where some countries, the US, were trying to use it as a free pass to get out of any sort of liability for helping with financial support for loss and damage in the future. Essentially, as you all know, the US is trying to get out of the Paris Agreement, and they want the governance of this mechanism to stay under the Paris Agreement, which means when they're out, they don't have to do anything about it. And so it is still a topic that the way how it ended at COP25, there's still leeway and room for negotiation to finalize and sort of get that governance issue in the how it should be legally settled, in that it needs to be governed by the convention itself, not just the Paris Agreement. And so that's on the books for COP26. On markets, as I said, countries agree to disagree. It's noteworthy that even though they didn't come out with a deal, this time around, no deal is better than a bad deal. And this, especially for when it relates to countries that are trying to make sure they get advantages. For example, a share of proceeds towards adaptation coming out of the market mechanisms for vulnerable countries, least developed countries, and so forth. The high political issues, high-level political issues are the things that are still up for negotiation, but the countries will maintain sort of the progress that came out of COP25 and where they got to, so they really only have the big level issues to sort out. Whether or not they can do it this time around, we'll see. And then on ambition, that was a rocky road where it was lots of ups and downs. In the end, the outcomes of COP did hold the line, but just barely. Essentially, countries did call for basically repeating what is in the Paris Agreement to submit new and updated climate pledges, NDCs, by 2020. But in addition to that, also stated that they needed to do so in accordance with the highest possible ambition and in accordance to the urgency needed, looking at how we need to close the emissions gap very quickly. And so what does this mean for COP26 and the LDCs? And this year in 2020 altogether? Basically, it's going to be a lot of rebuilding of trust, and I think Nick is going to speak a lot about that as well. But certainly look out for some hard negotiations on the flimsy and vague outcomes that came out of 25. The UK government and parties in general have an uphill battle to not only settle a lot of the agenda items that were supposed to be discussed at COP26, but a lot of not only markets and loss and damage governance, but a load of other agenda items which you would think would be simple, were also pushed over to be finalized at COP26. And another thing, especially for LDCs and the vulnerables, it's that this year it's going to be another uphill battle as well to show that enhancement of ambition, to show that countries are looking to really fulfill their promises on climate action that they made back in 2015. And in order to, it's not just that in terms of a mitigation sort of ambition scenario, but the LDCs and the vulnerables are looking for solidarity and for making sure that what the locked-in emissions now are only mean that there's going to be greater climate impacts hitting them in the near future. And so making sure that countries support them on their adaptation needs and loss and damage, and making sure that shows through in the outcomes of COP26 is going to be very important. And another part of that aspect of solidarity is finance. Finance is going to be a big thing on the agenda for COP26, particularly as we've now come to the 2020 deadline of countries having to show through that they're making their promises on delivering $100 billion US dollars per year by 2020, and also that there's going to be starting negotiations around defining a new quantitative long-term goal on finance. What happens now to this 100 billion number, if it gets changed or not going into the future. And all of these elements interlink, and we'll just have to see. But the LDCs, again, are going in with high expectations. It's very disappointing that promises and trust keeps continuing to getting eroded over the years in this system. And so it's going to be an uphill battle overall. But sorry to end on a negative-ish note, but 2020, you never know. We can hopefully we'll see some change in geopolitics at hand and all of that, but I think I'll end there.
It's okay, Gabby. In every good story, you always get a moment of doom before the fun. That's you. It's doing all the way across. Glasgow is going to be where it emerges then. All right. So Anna, I mean, Gabby's alluded to a couple of things that went wrong, perhaps misstepped by the presidency, etc. But what about the UNFCCC process itself? Is it actually capable of delivering what the LDCs and so on need delivered?
Yeah, I am going to be providing sort of an overview of elements of the UNFCCC process that perhaps indicate that there is a mismatch between the scale of ambition needed and what can be accomplished under the UNFCCC process. Now, we all knew that the Paris Agreement was sort of necessary but insufficient to meet what's required on climate change. So I think that that's not unexpected, but there are several things I think about this particular moment in time that negotiators at a minimum sort of failed to foresee when they were adopting the Paris Agreement. And this year we really saw an unprecedented civil society mobilization. And at COP25, that was not matched by government ambition. And I think that there are a couple of possible explanations for that. The optimistic explanation is that COP25 was essentially what I like to call a hangover COP. You often see these after the adoption of major agreements. So Paris, for instance, had Marrakesh, where you had limited movement, unambitious outcomes. You had The Hague after Kyoto, which completely failed to reach agreement and had to go into what was called the COP bis. You have Poznan after Bali. You have Marrakesh, obviously, after Paris. And you have Madrid after Katowice. These types of COPs are COPs where parties retrench to their previously held positions, to their red lines, where they try to renegotiate or reopen issues that were well agreed under the previous ambitious agreement. And under that interpretation, Madrid is simply a sort of a rebound effect from the adoption of the Paris Agreement rule set in Katowice, and COP26 should be able to pick up from that and move forward successfully. However, I do also think that in this transition to implementation, which is obviously a positive moment in time, it actually should be a moment for celebration, that we finally have the Paris Agreement, we have the rules set to be able to move forward into this implementation phase, which should be a moment of optimism, is actually in the process, because the process didn't consider that moment sufficiently in the actual Paris Agreement that it has actually created some dynamics that are going to be very concerning for the process moving forward. And there are several reasons for this. The process underneath the Paris Agreement and underneath the Katowice rule set did not create negotiating streams or even streams for dialogues around several really critical issues. This includes adaptation. So you could see at COP in Madrid that adaptation was largely absent from the negotiating agenda. There was also no negotiating agenda on ambition. In the year where countries are supposed to be increasing their nationally determined contributions. And so you have a complete absence of really critical issues from the space within the COP itself in order to be able to address really critical issues and at least, if not negotiate a new agreement, have dialogue between governments about these really important issues. And as a result, there is, I think, a fundamental perception that, one, by vulnerable countries, that important issues like adaptation are being left off the agenda and that they're no longer important, and also a failure to meet what civil society is calling for in terms of increased mitigation ambition, or at least an acknowledgement by governments that increased ambition is critically important. We've seen under adaptation, for instance, work has largely now moved to the Adaptation Committee, which in theory is good. It means that implementation can get started, but it also means that the COP itself isn't necessarily communicating either to governments or civil society that it's taking these issues seriously, which I think reduces trust in the process overall. So there's a need to ensure that really key issues like adaptation, mitigation, climate finance are adequately reflected in the agendas at COP, and to ensure that they're reflected in a balanced manner. So that all countries can sort of trust the process. There's also, in this new implementation phase, a lack of ability to create packages. There are individual mandates to negotiate specific issues like transparency or markets. The negotiations conclude on different timeframes and schedules, which means that there's no ability to trade across issues that are important to specific parties. And that makes it difficult to reach agreement on any single issue well into the future. So I'm very concerned that, for instance, the long-term climate finance negotiations that are going to launch in Glasgow, I'm worried that there's limited incentive for developed countries to deliver finance at scale absent other issues to trade across. Markets, I think this is going to be an increasing issue for this issue going forward. It was difficult to conclude even when it was part of a package in Katowice. So obviously it was very controversial, and it's going to remain difficult without other issues to link it to. And I think one of the driving reasons that one of the driving incentives to try to get markets done this year in 2019 was to resolve the rules in advance of 2020 to, in theory, encourage countries to increase their ambition. That is not an argument for solving markets at COP26 in 2020. It becomes irrelevant once the NDCs are submitted this year. And so I think that moving forward, markets may actually be even more difficult to resolve this coming year, unless some major actors two in particular, Australia and Brazil, move away from their long-held positions and are willing to accept rules that don't include the transfer of Kyoto units into the new system. And I think that this is, so this lack of this sort of mismatch and sort of lack of purpose to COPs is going to be particularly acute over the next 5 to 10 years until the Paris Agreement can demonstrate that implementation is actually happening. And so I think there's sort of an acute period of risk that COPs like COP25 will continue to happen until the UNFCCC can actually demonstrate that the Paris Agreement is working. Now, the GST, the global stocktake, will every 5 years sort of provide a sense of purpose to the system. That will be a critical COP in which the system has to demonstrate whether or not the global goal of the Paris Agreement is being met by individual countries' NDCs. But that leaves 4 other COPs that suffer from this lack of sort of driving central direction. And so I think that it's going to be really critical to think carefully about how to create purpose for those COPs. Because I do think that they are critically necessary to driving forward action at the domestic level, to countries increasing their ambition, and to providing space for vulnerable countries and civil society as well to bring their concerns and hold governments accountable. Now, there are a couple of ways to do that. If you think about sort of the implementation cycle in the Paris Agreement, it would make sense to hold an ambition COP after the GST is concluded. Countries need to respond at that point to the outcomes of the global stocktake. If they're meeting the global goal with their NDCs, great. Then countries simply need to come up with NDCs that continue on that trajectory. If they're not meeting the global goal, then they need to significantly increase their ambition during that year following the global stocktake. The COP after that, for instance, could possibly address climate finance. Once countries have submitted their NDCs, there's going to be a need to look at whether the climate finance available is enough to meet the needs of countries to implement their conditional NDCs, and then also finance loss and damage and adaptation that is consistent with the scale of mitigation ambition that's presented. I think it could also be useful to have a COP that looks at specifically at implementation, that looks at what's working, looks at innovative solutions from countries, that can really have deep conversations about how to turn these pledges that countries have made and that countries are then providing climate finance for, and really assess what sort of ideas and new innovation can be brought to bear. So I think that there are ways to find purposes for these COPs, but without a central driving purpose, COPs will continue to look like COP25. And so I think that that's really critical, is finding that sort of central purpose. So what does that mean for COP26? I think that COP26 will face a number of the same process challenges that created challenges at COP25. Even if COP COP25 had reached an agreement on markets, I think that COP25 would have still felt out of sync with what people all over the globe are demanding and with what vulnerable countries are demanding. So in the absence of an overarching and clear purpose, COP25 could easily fall into the same track. So it's critical, one, to define a clear purpose. Chile tried to overcome that lack of purpose problem by defining COP25 as an ocean COP and the ambition COP. However, without the lack of corresponding agenda items, it was difficult, particularly on ambition, it was really difficult to ensure that that was capturing the outcomes of COP. And then, as NDCs will be submitted in advance of COP26, I think that one successful approach could be defining COP as a response to the ambition that's submitted in the NDCs. So that means ensuring that the climate finance needed to implement conditional NDCs is available. And then also, in the light of the fact that, and this is particularly important for vulnerable countries like the LDC group, that the mitigation, it's pretty clear that the mitigation ambition in the NDCs that will be submitted in 2020 are still likely to fall short of the 1.5 degree goal. And so a focus on the scale of adaptation necessary and how to address the associated loss and damage that will be necessary, will also be necessary to maintain the trust of the vulnerable countries and developing countries in general in the COP26 process. So in that respect, it's also necessary to ensure a balanced agenda. So finding ways to re-embed adaptation and mitigation ambition into the agendas of COP and CMA will, I think, really support rebuilding trust in the process and providing space to have the types of conversations that people the world over are demanding. I think it's also critically necessary to find better ways to include civil society. Civil society has a critical voice as well, and COP did extend the mandate of the GSA, which is great. It's a forum to enable civil society inclusion in COP, but in 2020, I think it's going to be necessary to develop specific modalities in terms of how that will work moving forward, that build on the lessons learned from the pre-2020 work that has been done to bring civil society into the negotiations. And I think that it's critical to involve civil society in those discussions as well.
Great, thank you very much, Anna. Lots of food for thought. That's really interesting. I was in Glasgow briefly over New Year, and if it's clear, you can, if you look really hard, you can just see the sunlit uplands. So into all of this comes Boris Johnson. Nick.
So thanks for giving me the time to speak. So my disclaimer at the beginning is I am an advisor to the COP26 president, but everything I'm about to say is purely my team's views. We also advise European governments very intensively, as well as any other governments, so we're also incorporating other people's views of this. Like you said, but I think I would say it slightly more robustly using a rugby metaphor I'll explain, which is Madrid gave Glasgow a hospital pass. A hospital pass where someone chucks you the ball just before a load of very big people are about to jump on top of you. It's like if, as a discussion recently, it's like you wouldn't start from here. And you still wouldn't start from here with only 10 months if you're looking sideways to prepare for a COP. You'd want to be 2 or 3 years ahead. So there is no geopolitical momentum. There was an attempt to do it, but that stalled. And many of the big players, turned up even less than we thought they would. There was quite a lot of anger and disputes over whether it's the process or just people's responses. Ungeneralized anger. Let's have even more tricky negotiating points. people said they were second-tier things. Actually, the reason why people are disagreeing is actually there are some quite fundamental principles there about how the regime works. So it looks like technical issues, but it really isn't a technical issue. These are quite political issues the UK has to now deal with. And even more, in the public narrative was the UN regime has failed. No, UN regime organised a room, people came in, and the countries failed. But this is the narrative. The negative thing from COP25 is it really increased the diplomatic and political lift the UK needs to provide to deliver real progress in Glasgow. But perhaps it was also the kind of flip side of that is a bit of a positive wake-up call that failure is really on the agenda for Glasgow. And to quote Laurence Toubiana, who was at the heart of the Paris Agreement, if Glasgow fails, then the Paris regime fails, and we lose another 5 to 10 years building another regime. If we can't show that when we've reduced the cost of renewables and clean energy and EVs by around 60% since Paris unexpectedly, that countries still will not move their ambition, when for the same price as what they put on the table in Paris, they could get a very significant amount of more ambition, like the EU has put on the table, without spending any more money, if you want to use that narrative, then really that shows that this fundamental risk we took in Paris in constructing a regime with this kind of ratchet process has failed. And that means some people will really try and make sure Glasgow fails, because we're in the tough politics of climate. So COP26 is a really tricky ask. It's pivoting away from a world of textual negotiations, which was the backwash of Paris we've seen for the last years, to a regime which has the COP at its heart. It's not just the COP and the UN system, looking at ambition and delivery. This is a regime where the voices of LDCs and vulnerable countries is much less powerful in a simple realpolitik way, because most of the critical discussions are going to be bilateral, power-based discussions, well away from the negotiations. That is what Paris agreed. That was part of the bargain, poisoned bargain made in Paris. It's a hybrid regime. It has top-down elements, but it has bottom-up elements, and bottom-up elements are not done in the negotiating halls. So it's very tricky, and I'm very glad it's the UK who's trying to negotiate this really tricky pivot, because it's probably the most sophisticated and well-staffed climate diplomacy nation in the world, because it is really hard. So just to make that. So second point, UK is actually planning for a high ambition and high risk COP, because that is the only plausible strategy where it can get out of the COP looking like it has played its role. And that's fine. They are not going to manage expectations in a classic diplomatic way. The only way is to meet the maximum expectations possible. And there are 3 pillars of that. First is ambition, second is solidarity, third is text. And I won't go through all the elements there, but if I was going to give you my estimate of where the current balance of UK activity is, it's around 75% on ambition. That's increasing national contributions and long-term strategies. That's bilateral diplomacy, plurilateral diplomacy. It's working on real economy areas like coal, financial reform, MDB reform, combustion engine phase-out. So that's got networks of governments, institutions, businesses, cities, regions working on real economy commitments. That's probably around 3/4 of the effort they intend to put in this year. Nothing to not know at COP, it lands in COP, it informs COP, it produces a context, but that's what the presidency, I think. So probably, I'll look at generously putting around 10% into a solidarity package. They've doubled climate aid, they're going to go around and lobby other people to lobby climate aid. There's a real question, what is the package around resilience, loss and damage, etc., which goes in? And I think that's a bit of a fuzzier area, and then all the lovely things in the text will probably take up the other 15% over the year, in terms of what the 250 people sitting in Buckingham Palace Road will actually spend their time doing, plus the diplomats, 25 diplomats globally that work on climate change for the UK. So some of the issues that are still, haven't really launched properly, the issue of the balance between those agendas, between ambition, solidarity, text, regime change, is still very much in flux. There's a lot of space, and that will change over the year, and other countries will have viewpoints. It's just a presidency, they have to provide some drive and direction, but they don't decide the outcome. So there's a real area for engagement there, because no one knows the right way to run this. This is a real innovation. There is no kind of manual for how to build a global climate regime. Why make it up as we go along? The overall ambition piece will be very dependent on what China does. Because China has most of the emissions they could reduce by around 3 gigatons, which would be over half of what's possibly on the table. If China sets a long-term strategy, that's a huge signal, a net zero strategy, that they're going to eliminate carbon from their economy. And if they stop funding coal in the Belt and Road, and then we bring Japan and Korea along, that really kills the coal pipeline globally, which is a real signal. So, but that's going to be the EU-China Leipzig summit. It's the place where trying to encourage and engage with China to move it to the high end of expectations is going to happen, not the UK. Other things that are going to be going on, perceptions of the US elections is going to be pretty key. Will people be hedging on Trump too, or will there be an unambiguous lead for a Democratic candidate? Some star is going to come through. That's going to change an awful lot of what's going on. And also, the UK is thinking about different ways of rebooting the COP. What's the future role of the overall regime? How do we integrate these wonderful real economy things in? One thing we learned from the UN General Climate Action Summit is you can actually have really good stuff happening, but if you have really bad choreography, it doesn't add up to anything. So UNCAS, actually some people did some amazing stuff there, coal phase outs, Greece got rid of lignite. You wouldn't have heard it because it was dominated by, you know, Greta on one hand and then Trump and Modi having a bromance and then just a chaotic process of communication. So actually, how do we communicate what's going on? There's a big world, there's lots of stuff going on, but as we know, just having good stuff happening does not turn into political reality. Reality and political reality are two separate things and moving apart, and they're going to be driven apart by certain forces in the world spreading disinformation. How do we look at drive structural change forward going forward? What are some of the sinews of the global economy? We've got a new finance ministers group, we've got a new central banks group. So some really interesting bits of global architecture emerging. How do we deal with that? And then the last one, the phrase, the whole of society COP. So UK is probably the one country in the world we work where there is a whole of society discussion about climate change involving cultural institutions, normal people's areas. We're trying to capture that in London Climate Action Week, which will be the end of June, beginning of July this year in London. But the government has aims to get lots of cities around the UK. The Scottish government has plans for doing a lot of stuff in Scotland on subnationals, just transition, other areas. But it is a real opportunity for the world to come to the UK and see kind of the next stage of their progression. Because it's not that the UK is doing anything perfectly, but we have fundamentally changed over the last year and a half the conversation in this country and the involvement of different bits of our society, professions. You know, 250 museums in the UK are signed up to a climate emergency. It's just a really interesting place for people outside the UK. So that's one of the, again, one of these moving the whole conversation on. So lots of areas where we need to think really hard about how to do that and then make it manageable. So the third point is the UK will need a bit of pressure to get to where it needs to be. It's going to go around telling everybody else to do more. It needs to credibly do more. We've got a good target-ish. Yeah, I'm not going to worry about 5 years difference, to be honest, on meeting net zero. But we do need to make sure that no one can say, yeah, it's just a target you haven't delivered. So we need a plan for net zero. We need money attached to that plan for net zero. We need some key highlight policies, like phasing out internal combustion engines by 2030. UK wants to go and tell other people to do it, they better do it at home. We better stop funding fossil fuels abroad with our trade finance. That's pretty important. So there's a whole UK NGO campaigns around pieces of that. And we also need to deal with the risk of a Brexit disruption. COP is the second most important UK diplomatic priority this year. The first most important, this is official, is managing Brexit and the future trade regimes. But it's very important that the Prime Minister feels personally attached to the outcome of COP, and I'm assured he does, I've not spoken to him. But it's really important the Prime Minister feels extremely attached to the success of COP. That is something which sort of society and communication can achieve. Because without that personal connection to the success or failure of this biggest international event we've hosted for a long time, we won't get the top-down political attention in a year with many things. And that's the final bit for me. 2020 is going to be a very bumpy year. There's lots of stuff that's going to happen that's going to make it hard to keep focus. There's a little bit of Brexit stuff in the corner of the world, but in the big wide world, there's lots of things. It's very late in the day, and the UK, to be honest, is kind of scrabbling to build a big machine, and will make mistakes, and we need to also make sure that the thing is challenge those mistakes, but also make sure it's hearing what the world is saying. One of the things I noticed when I worked in government So I came from an NGO, global NGO, went to government and realised how much information they got had Union Jack spectacles on. They saw it through the prism of themselves, and it was very different to the feedback you got. I think as we all have global networks, one of the kind of friendly challenges and help we can give the UK government is being very clear about how they're being heard. Not just parroting other governments' lines to take because they're trying to spin people, but actually saying, look, you might think you're saying this, but you're being heard as this. Because they better be the best COP presidency ever if they're going to deliver Glasgow, and we need to give them all the help they get to do it. But we also need to, how are we going to handle if there's a big science bomb next year with climate sensitivity going up? We know that's in the models, we don't know if it's going to be in the narrative, but that will put 1.5 completely out of reach, even if we reach the same emissions levels, which in the IPCC report. How do we navigate the despair around that? How do we navigate an economic crisis? We've got a huge debt crisis building up across the world in emerging and developed economies. How do we spin that into a green recovery and stimulus, not a we can't do anything, there's no money for anything anymore? How do we navigate a UK election? How do we navigate India and China doing things which fundamentally on human rights basis we think are awful, but they are the critical partners to solve the climate crisis? That is going to be a real issue for the movement across its multifaceted means, to make some tough choices about what are the right ways to engage with these major powers, given Kashmir and the restoration law, the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and everything else. And that's going to lead, we're going to see a lot of green on green conflict, because from a little scientific based movement, this is now a proper social movement with lots of people with different views on tactics, strategy, outcomes. Are you in favour of reparations? Do you have to pull down capitalism to solve climate change? Do you need to hyper-capitalism to solve climate change? Is the problem the state? Is the problem the market? Those are all people who believe in 1.5 will have very different views. And there's also, if you've been watching the Australian bushfires social media coverage, a lot of people out there who will work to magnify those disputes, to confuse the public. There's a lot of disinformation out there. And we need to build resilience inside our conversations and respect people having different views for the same aims, and understand what is legitimate different views and what are not legitimate different views, because people don't have the same aims, actually trying to use climate to achieve other aims, or there's just growing up. The movement's got to grow up a bit to be more like a normal social movement, because it hasn't really been, and realise when other people are trying to exploit our debates for their ends. So all the other side has to do is delay. And they make hundreds of billions every year. So that's a pretty big prize to spend on a few troll farms and some interesting and imaginative social media. And it's not like they haven't been doing on every other issue and every other election, and our issue is one of their main issues. So to finish, so overall, we need to make sure that COP26 leads people from legitimate anger to a sense of agency, even though we won't get what we want. Because pulling down the regime is the biggest present we could ever give Putin or the Saudis or anybody else who has lots of fossil fuels. Because which doesn't mean the regime is perfect, but the real problem is in the countries. So we need to know how to adjust to the post-Paris reality, build a new approach, working with the UK government, but civil society's got to find a new approach. The mobilising movement's got to find a new approach. The think tank's got to find a new approach. And it's good the UK government is taking this responsibility for steering the world for this. Some in the UK advised that UK government shouldn't take this on. I thought that was probably quite wise advice, but I also wanted the UK to do it because there was no one else prepared to step up. So much as we're going to have to challenge the UK to do it, we also realise this is a really tough job. And in a sense, we've got part of the responsibility being in the UK to help navigate this process, because really, if we pull down this regime, you can just kiss goodbye to all of these other pieces. And we haven't got the space to be self-indulgent about this. We have to make some really tough choices about what we want and how to get out of it and how we can contribute to make it happen.
Right, lovely. Thanks so much. So Claire, falls to you to put all of this together, I think, and the conflicts of factors that are emerging during 2020, the bumpy road.
The bumpy road.
Yeah.
And try and find some sunlight along the way. I'm not sure there's a lot. So yeah, we've heard the Paris Agreement hangs in the balance. It's been said it's on life support right now, and as Anna's pointed out, we've got a few years to go. And this dissolution of trust, this real crisis, is in part about domestic politics. It's the populist leaders that we've seen arise, US, Australia, Brazil, Russia continues, India and China. South Africa is actually the only one of the BRICS that's showing any level of progressive, and is actually distancing itself a little bit from the other BRICS at the moment. And one of the elements of this is this cognitive dissonance, this ability to be saying, this isn't climate change, at the same time as your country is going through the most massive impacts. And it's also about our ability to just look at a few places. So we're all talking about Australia at the moment. What about Zimbabwe? What about Zambia? There's big things happening in the world that we're just not even looking at, we're not hearing about. And then there's the challenge of reform. So we've had France and Germany try to do quite big things over the last few years and really struggle to bring it through their domestic political agenda. And we see people protesting when in many countries across the world they're trying to remove fossil fuel subsidies, and that's been going on now for as long as I can remember. Actually, I'm trying to think when it first started. So trying to find authentic leadership and support it isn't simple, and it has been a domain of small economies. So New Zealand's a nice example at the moment, Denmark, but it's also the domain of the vulnerable countries. And whilst they also struggle to get things through in their domestic agenda, they are saying that their intentions are much more, I mean, what they're saying and their shown intentions are much closer to what's needed to happen than most of the other countries in the world. So we need to find our leadership where we can. We've had net zero commitments by a huge number of countries now, but Richard's ECIU did a summary out. It's how many countries now?
Well, the latest
15?
The latest came out was, what, 120 odd now that came out yesterday. So,
oh, 120 as of yesterday, okay.
So
So there you
tell
go.
everyone else about
We've got a lot of countries making strong commitments, but we need to hold all of those countries to account, because it's no good just saying they're going to do it. We need to start seeing delivery quickly and show what is possible in those countries that can move. So smaller economies, vulnerable countries are going to be the ones that we're going to see things move in faster, because they've got the social cohesion in those smaller economies, and also because the vulnerables have got so much more on the line that it's more politically possible. But the EU's net zero and the UK's net zero commitments are vital to making progress on this. And here we are sitting very close to both of those centres of power. The social movement's also critical, and they continue, and that's good, but it needs to not just be a northern social movement process, and we are seeing it beginning to emerge in other places. But the risk of civil society being seen to be a threat to the politics rather than a supporter of it is part of what we need to resolve in this next year. We need to see those civil society movements being translated into concrete and coherent responses at local levels to help governments act, rather than just shout at governments. The other issue is following the money. So there's big progress in terms of the big centres of finance about what they're saying they'll do. The problem is that a lot of that finance just sits in the same old. So when you're looking at sort of global flows, very little of it gets to the vulnerable countries. But we do see some businesses beginning to really look at greening their supply chains. That reaches into the developing south, and we need to find spotlight that type of progress. What's real, meaningful, and authentic? And it's not just about shouting at those that aren't doing enough. It's showing how to do it. That it's so critical at the moment. There's so many countries struggling, there's so many businesses struggling, that what we have to focus on is highlighting the possibilities. So 2020 is this super year. We have this huge moment in the climate world, but it's also the UN 75th anniversary. It's the UN summit on nature, climate and oceans, and the Dutch is holding the adaptation summit, and we've got CBD, we've got the nature focus, that we're going to be resetting targets. And if we could bring those together so that we are building an alliance for the type of change that is actually coherent across those agendas over this year, we'd be making things a lot easier for ourselves. But multilateralism is also under threat. So there's, the Trump election could completely undermine a lot of what we hold dear. So I think what you were saying, Nick, about really not trying to pull down the regime, but trying to support it, is really critical in this particular year. But it's also about pointing out those vested interests. Those people that are hiding behind other people. Those people that are, they're talking about job losses, but actually what they're really talking about is their own businesses being undermined. What we need to do is get support to those people who are in jobs in the oil and gas industries or high carbon industries and support them into new areas of meaningful work, rather than focus on the vested interests. So, here we are, beginning of 2020, and we have the UK government as the incoming leader on climate change. As Nick so ably pointed out, they have a number of priorities. But the question really is this going to be a train crash? Or is it going to be the most perfect moment where you bring together the opportunities on trade and on climate, and making sure that all finance is aligned to Paris? It's possible in this particular moment where the UK is reforming itself and completely reinventing itself to do something really quite special. But it won't be delivered through a very simplistic approach. And what my biggest worry about Boris is that my understanding is that he doesn't read and he doesn't like very complicated messages. So the civil service is going to have to be very nimble and very clever to be able to highlight a story and a narrative that takes us through both Brexit, new trade deals and leading on climate in a way that is credible and authentic. And I have to say, when Boris spoke at the climate summit in September, were you there? It just wasn't very credible at all. He spoke a lot about being a mayor, which is fine, but really, I mean, you know, you're leading a country now, you're also leading the negotiation process. So he needs to be convinced and persuaded that there are clear messages to tell, whilst at the same time really pinpointing those new political drivers for change. And part of this is around citizens demanding action. And so that we are pinpointing all those countries that are going to have an election this year and making sure that every election is a climate election. Every time there's a climate moment when a natural disaster hits, make sure that it's clear that that is not a natural disaster, that is a political disaster. That is a government failing to act and anticipate what is an entirely predictable climate moment. So, and the final bit of what the UK government has to do is understand that adaptation and climate finance is part of the deal. The Paris deal is based on a number of countries all signing up as long as they got support on adaptation and they got climate finance. And just focusing on mitigation, you're only talking to some countries. And even countries that are quite developed now, we are seeing, are beginning to suffer climate impacts, Australia, the US. So how do we make that into an opportunity and really begin to change the politics in those countries? So 3 thoughts. Build broad coalitions, be incredibly brave, and focus on trust, because that's the fundamental underpinning of Paris. So building broad coalitions, it needs to go beyond just central government. We talk about whole of society. That's exactly what we've been talking about for some time. It needs to go beyond just climate. It needs to be looking at poverty. It needs to be looking at nature. And recognising that the UK is a good friend to some countries, but it's going to be asking a lot of countries all at the same time. So it can't just be the UK going out and trying to do this deal. You need to find your allies, and quickly. There is a huge number of high ambition countries in the vulnerables and in the small economies. So let's work with those. They may not be the most significant in terms of economic deals, but they are the ones that can put pressure on as an alliance. So ignoring them just because they're not your trading partners is the biggest risk, I think. Being brave. Let's stop worrying about consensus, because the lowest common denominator is all you'll get from consensus. That's where Madrid went wrong. It was a moment where they tried to just pull out of the bag a consensus statement, and it was so low ambition that everybody went into crisis mode. We have to connect the North and South. It's not just about the G20, it's also about, well, the LDCs are calling themselves the G47. Well, they are. They're the largest negotiating bloc that exists. We need to find authentic positions on the big issues, on markets, loss and damage, and climate finance, and then form alliances around those authentic positions, rather than trying to form alliances and then come up with what everyone might buy into. So there's a huge amount to do, but the first part of that, of being brave, is the UK has to be credible. So the net zero target is fabulous, but you've just pointed out all the things that need to happen for that to actually be credible in any way. It's no good just making these statements anymore. You need to put the policies and the finance in straight away to prove out that this is possible. The other issue that's really important in that is the transparency. So it got pushed into what should have been a really simple and fairly technical area of the Madrid negotiations, got pushed out. because it was being undermined, it's so essential that we get a large group of countries just saying, no, we buy into this really boring spreadsheet, and we will do it, and it's really boring, but we'll just do it. And then anyone else that is saying, oh, we won't do it, is left hanging out. We need to start pointing out the people that won't join in, rather than trying to make joining in so simple. So the final thing is around building trust, is around solidarity, and to get that, you need to be listening with empathy. And the UK government isn't always very good at that. I've been part of the civil service myself, so I know. Listening with empathy and understanding what the issues are for other countries. So even in India, the conversation between the UK government and India is likely to be largely about emissions. But actually, India is made up of a number of states, with some of the states are as poor as Chad and as poor as Somalia. So let's recognise that climate justice is as big an issue for the Indias and the Chinas of the world as it is for the Malis. We also, the UK really needs to recognise, and all of the developed countries that have been giving climate finance need to put their hands on their heart and say, yes, we do know that climate finance hasn't been working. Stop talking about how much you've committed, and start talking about how much you've dispersed and has made a difference. And then people will begin to trust in this thing. Until we get us talking on much more real terms about how far export credit are Paris aligned and our climate finance is working and all our other machinery as a government is actually delivering. It just is incredible, and it's no good pretending that if you just keep stating something over and over again, it will be. So trust requires putting your hand on the heart, all of the countries, and saying, we haven't got it right yet, but we are committed to getting climate finance to be better quality and getting it to the places where it will make most difference. The real economy, a lot is happening. We could do a lot more just by highlighting that, and that would also begin to build trust. There's huge opportunities for going much faster and going to greater scale, because we have learned what works. And subsidiarity of actually allowing decisions to be made much closer to the people that are going to be affected by things would make a huge difference. So one big commitment on that would make a big difference. And then finally, I mean, the geopolitics are not aligned, as others have said, but we have these glimmers of light, and we can add them up and begin to feel a sense of possibilities. Then other people want to join this train rather than keep trying to stop it.
Great, thanks so much, Claire.
Trying hard on the lights.
So I'm going to come to your questions and observations in just a moment, if I can, but there's just a couple of things that I just wanted to pick up. So, Gabby, you going right back to your piece, one of the things you talked about was sort of different blocks and different alignments and so on, and that's also been presented by other speakers, you know, the LDCs. But I mean, you said, you know, the days of sort of developing versus developed has gone away. We don't always see that reflected in sort of coverage and analysis of what happens. So is there a job to be done in sort of getting out there that sort of old bilateral thing just isn't the thing anymore, and we should be talking about, you know, constructive versus unconstructive or something like that?
When you're saying that, I am picking up exactly on what Claire said in terms of looking at what would be a credible or a way of dealing with an issue that is the best possible way, and then build consensus around that, versus then building consensus and trying to find a solution that works for that alliance. And that way, it not to say these divisions aren't there; they're deep-seated, but it's that's the whole premise of Paris, that it moves beyond that sort of traditional divide and is looking at how all countries can make contributions to the best of their ability. So,
running over for questions.
Yeah. Fun that is arriving in office.
No, I had a really hard question lined up for me.
Claire, do you mind just moving?
Yeah, great, thanks. Anna, picking up on basically one thing that you mentioned and one thing that Nick mentioned as well, you were talking about there being a sort of dislocation in a sense between the sort of formal agenda that we're often seeing in COPs and the big issues, the sort of ambition and the adaptation and so on. And Nick was also mentioning that from his perspective of the bulk of the UK's effort so far is going into ambition, which is perhaps divorced from text. So how, in your view, can this all be brought together best in the road to Glasgow?
That, I think, is a very difficult question. On ambition, I mean, this year is complicated because NDCs are due within the first quarter of the year. Granted, a number of countries, including a lot of vulnerable countries, won't be able to submit within that first quarter, but mitigation ambition will largely be locked in within the first 6 months of the year. And so I do think that there's a real risk of trying to frame COP around mitigation ambition. I think that COP is actually better framed as a response to what's in those NDCs than some sort of push towards higher ambition.
About how those NDCs are delivered?
Yeah. Are they consistent with the 1.5 degree goal? The answer is probably not. So if they're not in line with the 1.5 degree goal, what does that mean for adaptation in terms of the scale of adaptation that's needed? What does that mean in terms of the increase in terms of loss and damage? And then how do you mobilize climate finance to both and in this respect, it could be framed as an ambition COP on climate finance, because at that point, you know what countries are asking in terms of their conditional NDCs. And so is international climate finance, are countries ready to meet those needs of developing countries? Now, we know that climate finance is currently not sufficient to, I mean, if you look at LDC NDCs right now, their conditional NDCs add up to something like $93 billion in LDCs alone. And when you look at the agreed scale of climate finance, it's only $100 billion. And we're not talking about the conditional NDCs of India, China, any of the major emitters. And so we know that climate finance is woefully inadequate to meet the scale of what's going to be in these NDCs. And so I do think that there's a role for framing COP around this notion that, all right, mitigation ambition is currently locked in where it is, but how do we get to the high end of those NDCs? It's by financing the conditional aspects of developing countries' NDCs. So I think that that's going to be a really critical way of framing it. And then around these issues of adaptation and loss and damage in the context of some of the major emitters failing to come up with really ambitious targets.
And Claire, China, both you and Nick mentioned China from different perspectives. I mean, it is the biggest emitter. It can probably have the biggest scope of any country or any bloc really for sort of shaving down quite spectacularly. And you also mentioned the Conventional Biological Diversity Summit that's happening. So is there a play out there? Is there a diplomatic play for the UK and its allies to sort of bring China in as a kind of leadership, that kind of thing? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, they in this at the UN Climate Action Summit in September last year, China was given leadership on nature-based solutions, with the idea of that being a sort of bringing together the climate and CBD agendas. And it only got so far, but there's a huge potential to get further, I think, in the run-up to Kunming and between Kunming and the COP. For China to see actually how much of their emissions could also be captured within land use decisions and how they actually manage their landscapes, but also to see it as a possibility of improving water flows and all of the other benefits. So bringing the climate and nature agendas together this year, I think, is a way of bringing China closer to the fold. And China seeing itself more allied with the EU and the progressives than with the Brazils and the Indias.
Yeah. Okay, your questions, comments. Yes, chat at the back there, please. And just say who you are and where you're from.
You don't have a mic. No?
No.
I'm from northeastern state of India, Jharkhand, which is the biggest mining state of India. And I only learned about this state about 15 years ago because of a Canadian photographer who did a SOAS thing quite a few years ago. So I didn't know anything about climate change, I didn't know anything about mining aspects in India. And then when studying supply chains of mine back and just learning about it and going to India and looking at all the stuff and thinking India's just about coal, when I follow the supply chains from India, when I follow the supply chains from the Congolese, when I follow the supply chains from provinces in China and Australia as well, and I follow it back to the UK in terms of, you know, like the products, not the tree, here's the issue. Yes, there is a lot of coal being mined in India and Australia and China, but there's a massive slave labour and sex slave labour and massive oppression, but those people are not mining those resources just for coal. They're mining lithium, cobalt, bauxite. So all the journalists here better take notice. All these solutions which the West is proposing to actually help India and China, which are doing the most pollution, but actually most of those populations are the ones actually making the products for us in the West, so it's a bit trite to actually accuse us, is actually for the wind turbines and solar panels. And I could actually show you all the reports and all the studies showing how the slave labour and the sex slave labour is a byproduct of the resources that you need for your clean green solar panels and wind turbines.
So what do you think that means for the road to Glasgow? And,
well,
is there a point question you'd like to put to one of our panellists?
This is what kind of one of the famous rappers in the UK has actually said. This is green colonialism for the 21st century. There's no accountability of where these, everyone's attacking the coal industry. But for the wind turbines, you've got a base that still needs cement. Cement is made by burning coal. You need to get the lithium and the cobalt. So I'm fed up of actually seeing every single conference I've gone to the last few years. I'm looking around, and the only people I'm actually seeing who are of ethnic minority are not on the panel. They are in the crowd, maybe 5 or 6 of them. So firstly, the issue is that you need to divvy up.
That's not entirely true, actually.
No, okay, so one out. Yeah, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. I'm not joking.
Well,
right?
there's
green colonialism, racism here.
Let's get a
and let's
response
talk about
to that.
the resources stolen for your green solar panels.
Let's get a response to that, because IIED has a very, very strong development agenda as well. That's the D in the name. So I wonder if, and we haven't also really talked about just transitions as well. So let me, hang on, I think sorry, okay, let's get a response. Claire, would you like to come back on?
Unless you want to, Andy.
No, you can.
I mean, the mining issue is massive, and we have a couple of people working on that in IIED, so we can talk to you afterwards about that work. We work with the least developed countries, so our interest in supporting countries like DRC and many others that are having similar problems to Jharkhand is very high. The issues are not simple, but the mining companies are also ones that have some of these wicked problems, that they're really struggling with their supply chains, with their processes, and part of the process is forming better dialogues and better engagement at that local level, so the mining companies can actually begin to understand how to work better with the communities. It's not a simple problem.
Why should I give up my land and have the people from the north steal my land?
So there are solutions, and let's talk about them.
That's not tenable at all.
No, I agree.
So it's not sustainable. So firstly, you need to clarify, why is these solar panels and wind turbines a solution
Let's take
when
this.
it's actually raping my land?
Let's have this
I know this is very
discussion
important to you, but we've got 80 odd other people who probably want to get their points.
You need to tell us the truth.
But booking time.
And
We've got 13 minutes left. I'd really like to hear from a few other people, if that's all right. Claire, do you want to add any more?
No, I'd really like to talk to you afterwards.
Okay, yes, chap in the second row, please.
A question and a comment. Just picking up on Anna's point, as I understood it, you're saying that there was the issue of the kind of blocking countries that is one issue, but you were saying also perhaps that there was a lack of a ambition and consolidated message perhaps coming from developing countries as well. And I'm interested in what your analysis was of the underlying issue there. Is it a lack of capacity, technical focus? Is it political will or coordination? What was the underlying issue there? And then the comment was just completely agree with Claire's kind of summary of what needs to happen. I would just say in the broad coalitions, don't forget about the role of enlightened business. There are parts of the business world that are really trying to do the right thing, and in some cases I would say ahead of where governments are, and I do think that there could be quite a powerful coalition between civil society, business and enlightened developing countries in really driving change. Thank you.
Would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think that in many ways it's more of a structural problem than a capacity problem. There was not space within sort of the official agendas of, like, yes, the Chilean presidency held roundtables on a number of issues that they had identified as priorities. Those conversations from what I saw were actually fairly successful, but there's no way to bring those conversations sort of into the official negotiating process and the official outcomes at the Conference of the Parties. So I think that's a problem. A second problem with those roundtables is that the Chilean presidency didn't clearly communicate what the purpose of those panels were to parties until, I would say, beginning of second week of COP, and that is well too late to actually prepare for a successful conversation, or for countries to prepare sort of what they want in terms of outcomes for those types of roundtables. And so in that regard, you know, if there is sort of an external process to what's happening at COP, those need, and a clear purpose for them needs to be defined early enough so that parties can actively participate.
Okay. Yes, lady.
Thank you very much. It's Dr. Jehan Baban. I'm the founder and the president of the Iraqi Environment and Health Society UK. We know there are natural causes of climate change, which is maybe example volcano in the Philippines, but there are man-made, which is the war. Iraq, for example, which is past 4 wars, destruction for the environment and the biodiversity, water scarcity and desertification. All this made sandstorms higher, which caused pollution to the air, climate change, open air burning of waste, which is poisoning the air, causing more health problems to young children and the elderly. What are your opinions about this?
I think that probably lands with me again. I guess one of the biggest risks is in a time where there is huge transition in a number of countries, and those countries that have benefited from selling oil and gas, and that opportunity to sell it becomes less possible, and countries state sitting contract becomes challenging. We're trying to remove fossil fuel subsidies, you create all sorts of issues. The sort of risk that we're going to see countries beginning to slightly implode and then look for how they can outsource that problem so that everyone's focused on an external factor and start picking wars with their neighbours. So it's not really an answer to your problem. Obviously war's a bad thing and it would be nice for it to stop, and it drives climate change, as you say. Defence is a huge source of emissions, but actually resolving that is in some ways, we've got a period of 5 to 10 years, if we get the transition to happen, where a lot of countries are going to be going through some fairly fundamental transitions, And I guess how that's dealt with and how we try and support those countries so that they're not going choosing to try and divert public opinion by picking wars with their neighbours will be a critical factor in this time.
Thanks. Chloe.
Clare Shakya from Climate Home News. I have a question for Claire, but I guess anyone can answer. You mentioned some alliances that the UK might want to look out for in terms of having to go and ask lots of countries, maybe competing asks sometimes, in terms of trade deals and COP26. What would those alliances look like? Who are the allies that the UK can rely on? Are we talking about the EU? Are we talking about vulnerable countries like the Marshall Islands or kind of that type of country? And what would it be? Quite public alliance, or would it be something that kind of happens in the background? Like, how do you imagine that playing out?
Well, do you want to, or shall I? So the way I'm thinking about it is there are small economies like New Zealand or Denmark, as well as the EU, not all of the EU, but the progressives within the EU more specifically, and then yes, the vulnerables coming together. To start off with, in more closed room situations, really working through what the progressive and authentic text might be, what the progressive and authentic rules might be for managing some of these more critical issues, or resolving how to structure climate finance so it's more effective, and then beginning to broaden it out and make it more public through the year. So starting quite quickly and quite soon with those that are aligned on a more progressive position, and try and build out from that rather than starting with a large group of people and then your consensus is a very low bar indeed. So trying to find those that are progressive enough that they will be allied, setting the bar at a credible level that will begin to convince the social movements, for example, that action is possible and will be done.
Can that dynamic then be held at the COP, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah, Gary.
And just to add on to that, the UK is also very well positioned at the moment with existing networks with the Commonwealth, for example. That's a solid base of countries that they have formed great relationships with. That they and I'm from Jamaica, sorry. They have an existing relationship with these countries where they're already talking about other foreign policy issues, and so basically using really working with and supporting these networks that they're already attached to can help bring climate into conversations that are outside of traditional climate spaces. In the foreign policy now, especially as they're seeking to explore different countries to create different alliances with through trade and so forth because of Brexit and so forth, involving and bringing climate into those conversations is another way to identify which countries and which regional groups might be more receptive to having climate on the agenda in different areas as well.
We've got time if we're quick for a couple more questions. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Marge. I'm from University College London, and I have a question regarding what do you look forward to the first intersessional in June 2020 with SB 52 and how that would impact potentially on COP26.
Who'd like that one? Anna, you're looking forward to Bonn,
I think that the intersessional will really set the tone for certainly the technical negotiations moving forward. What we need to see out of the intersessional is a clear path forward on Article 6. How are they going to progress, on the basis of which text? Those are highly technical issues. Transparency, which moved forward under Rule 16 of the Rules of Procedure, and so that means that there technically is the basis on which work would start would be what existed at the beginning of COP25, and However, if we're going to make quick progress forward on transparency, I would want to see us moving forward on the basis of the work that we actually did during COP. So if there's agreement to move forward on the basis of the work that was completed, that would be the best possible scenario. I'm not entirely confident that that's going to happen. And then I would want to see out of the session intersessional work on both transparency and on markets. Without those, it's going to be difficult to see how those two issues resolve with COP26. So ensuring a really quick start and that a lot of detailed technical work gets done. I think that it's going to be critical to try to balance. One of the reasons why transparency wasn't able to move forward was that it was blocked because some countries felt that that transparency was getting more time than was fair. And there's a lot of work to be done on transparency and a number of sub-agenda items under it, which is one of the reasons why it got so much time. But I think that the UNFCCC Secretariat needs to consider how to ensure that there is balance